December in rural Ontario isn't exactly known for the unexpected. And in Moffat, Ontario, 1996 was ending like most years did there. Calm, nothing out of the ordinary. For 42-year-old Wayne Grivette, those final weeks of 1996 were supposed to be the start of something new. He'd spent his adult life in the beverage industry, not just working the business, but learning it. The machinery, the distribution, the logistics of moving liquids from point A to point B. It was his chosen trade, his expertise. But by late 1996, Wayne was ready to take what he knew and put it to work for himself. He began building a small spring water operation on the family farm. Something humble, something local, something he could grow on his own terms. And it was working. Things were looking good, right up until December 12th, 1996. That morning, a package showed up on the Grivette doorstep. Wayne's son, 21-year-old Justin, brought it inside along with the rest of the day's mail. It looked like a gift, wrapped in white paper, trimmed in dark green, tied neatly with a ribbon. It also looked like someone had taken their time with it. Wayne's wife, Diane, and Justin were in the living room when Wayne finally sat down with it. There wasn't any hesitation, no suspicion, just another package to open on a Thursday in December. Wayne untied the ribbon, peeled back the wrapping paper, and lifted the lid. Inside was a wine box, domain door. Not a bottle, just the box. The barcode and UPC had been cut out of the cardboard. Not in a sloppy way. It looked deliberate. Someone had removed the only piece of the box that could ever trace back to a store, a distributor, even a shelf. Anything with a paper trail. The rest of the package was totally ordinary, and sitting on top of folded-up local newspaper flyers that were used as packing material was a heavy gray Duracell floating lantern. Justin grabbed it first. He tried to flick the switch, but nothing happened. He twisted the casing, but again, nothing happened. The plastic didn't move, didn't bend, it didn't give even a little bit. Justin passed it off to his dad. Wayne was on the couch, glasses on, skimming a business proposal someone named William J. French had sent along with the package. The letter talked about a new venture, something called Acton Home Products. It name-dropped two people named Lisa and Joe, old industry colleagues that Wayne actually knew. Reading it, you could almost hear the tone the sender was going for. Reassuring, friendly, even a little flattering. Like it was written to lower the reader's guard just enough to stop asking questions. And it worked, because while he was reading the document, Wayne casually pressed the lantern's button with his thumb, not expecting anything more than the lamp to turn on. But that didn't happen. Instead, there was a blast. In the seconds that followed, the Grivette house was no longer a home. It became a crime scene. Investigators would later confirm what was obvious to everyone by then. The lantern wasn't sealed shut by glue. It was sealed shut because it wasn't a lantern anymore. It had been rebuilt from the inside out. The lantern had been hollowed out, refitted, and reconstructed into an improvised explosive device. The trigger was a single AA battery. The payload included more than a pound of superfrac, a mining explosive that, shockingly, could still be bought off the shelf without a license well into the late 1970s. The casing wasn't just packed with explosive. It was also packed with roofing nails. Hundreds of them, meant to do the most damage possible. Wayne never had a chance. There was no time to stand, no time to shout, no time to understand what was happening. The explosion killed him almost instantly. Diane and Justin survived, but barely, by literal inches. One moment they were sitting beside their husband and father, everything as normal as ever. The next, they were thrown into an explosion of noise and debris. Ears ringing, skin stinging, bodies hit with shrapnel, dust, splintered wood, and fragments of drywall and glass falling around. Detectives on the case quickly jumped on details found in the letter, the first big clue left at the scene. The man in the letter, William J. French, wasn't a real person, and the company he claimed to represent, Acton Home Products, was also not real. The return address was a fake, too. The entire letter and business proposal was pure fiction. And yet, whoever wrote the letter knew Wayne better than they should have. They knew he'd recently moved. They knew he'd left Acton. They knew he was now living in Moffat. Remember, this was in 1996, and that's not the kind of detail you could get easily. But it got even stranger. Detectives would discover that just weeks before the explosion that killed Wayne Grivette, two men had been seen at the Acton post office asking for the Grivette's new address. It wasn't a coincidence anyone could ignore. Someone was looking for him. Someone was making sure they could still reach him. From inside the package itself, investigators recovered a circular for Copeland Lumber, a flyer that was only distributed in the Milton area. Not Toronto, not Ottawa, not somewhere in Ontario. Milton, only 12 miles away from Moffat. And the letter itself gave them something else too. Not a name, not a motive, but a fingerprint. Kind of. Detectives found that it had been typed on a Smith Corona electric typewriter using a script 10/12 daisy wheel. Most people, including me, wouldn't know what that even means. But forensic analysts did. And because one arm on that typing wheel was bent, every single period printed slightly crooked. It was a small defect, a manufacturing flaw, but it was a consistent one and uniquely identifiable to that specific typewriter. Investigators even recovered 2 strands of hair from the wreckage that did not match any of the Grivet family. But there were no roots left on the hair. No roots meant no nuclear DNA. No nuclear DNA meant no full profile. Whatever biological lead they had stopped there. As the physical evidence ran dry, detectives did what detectives always do. They rewound the tape and looked at the past. The strongest theory they came up with was centered around a man by the name of Ed Gallick, Wayne's former business partner. They'd had a bitter split years earlier. Accusations, resentment, rumors of stolen business ideas, a friendship that ended badly. But even with all that tension, investigators could never answer the real question. How does someone go from bad blood in business to building a bomb that looks like a Christmas gift? Besides, there was no evidence linking Gallick to the package, the typewriter, the explosives, or the search at the post office. No matter how hard they pulled on that thread, it never connected to murder. And then there was the letter's final line, the only moment where the tone slipped. The postscript read, "Didn't realize you had moved. Had some trouble finding you. Have a very Merry Christmas, and may you never have to buy another flashlight." It was cold, personal, and unnecessary. It's the kind of sentence someone writes when they want to be remembered. And for more than 30 years, that line has been something no one can shake. Not the explosives, not the typewriter, not the fake name. Instead, it's the voice behind it. The brief moment where the mask truly dropped. Somebody planned it. Somebody built it. Somebody mailed it. And that somebody, or somebodies, is still out there. A murderer. A cold-blooded killer that's known only by a missing barcode and a crooked typewriter. If you have any information that could help solve the murder of Wayne Grivet, please contact your closest Royal Canadian Mounted Police location. In June of 1974, 14-year-old Margaret Ellen Fox, Maggie to everyone who knew her, was getting ready to start summer in her hometown of Burlington, New Jersey. Maggie wasn't looking to lay around all summer. She wanted to start working and was ready to start making her own money. So she put a babysitting ad in the local paper. Something simple and direct. Babysitter available. And shortly after the ad was run in the paper, a man calling himself John Marshall called Maggie, saying that he needed someone to watch his kids the following weekend. But after making the initial plans to babysit and meet for an initial interview, John continued calling Maggie's house, over and over again. He kept changing details about the job at first, and then he began changing the time and place of the interview. Still, this was Maggie's first real job, so she stayed polite and professional. Eventually, a meeting was set for June 24th, 1974, but he didn't invite Maggie to his home and told her that he wouldn't be able to come to hers. Instead, he told her to meet him at a local park in the nearby town of Mount Holly, New Jersey, about a 15-minute bus ride away. He told her to look for a red Volkswagen when she arrived. That morning, Maggie's younger brother walked her to the bus stop and watched her board the 541 bus, heading toward Mount Holly. When dinner came and went without Maggie returning home, her parents began a frantic search for her. By nightfall, Burlington City Police and the FBI were involved. Realizing the potential for a kidnapping, investigators took the immediate precaution of installing a recording device on the Fox family's telephone. And they didn't have to wait long before the phone rang, and the voice on the other end confirmed their worst fears.
$10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping.
Who is it?
The voice was calm. There was no panic in his voice, no urgency, no emotion at all. He said it like it was nothing. 10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping. That one sentence, spoken to Maggie's mother, would become one of the most analyzed pieces of criminal audio in the state's history. That line told them something about the person on the other end of the line. He wasn't just asking for money, he was letting them know that he was in control. When they traced the number John Marshall gave Maggie, it led them to a public payphone at a grocery store in Lumberton, New Jersey, just a few miles from where she was last seen. Once the story hit the news, more families spoke up about similar experiences with a man calling teenage girls about jobs that didn't really exist. He wasn't impulsive. He was methodical. He seemed to comb through the help-wanted ads, making calls over and over until one day he found a girl that said yes. But the case quickly went quiet. And as the decades passed and tips dried up, files were archived. Maggie Fox would be in her 60s now, and her story is still unresolved to this day. The FBI is offering a reward of $25,000 for information leading to an arrest. If you have any information concerning the disappearance of Margaret Ellen Fox, or can identify the voice in the recording, please contact your local FBI office. April 20th, 1990 was a Friday that started like any other in Eagan, Minnesota. 17-year-old Christopher Kurz told his parents he didn't feel well and he was going to stay home from school and sleep. It was a request his parents didn't think twice about as they headed out to work. They trusted him. But when they came home that evening, the driveway told a different story. Their 1988 Dodge Caravan was gone. Inside, the house was dark and quiet. Christopher wasn't home, but there was a handwritten note from him on the kitchen counter. It said something had come up and he'd be back by 6 p.m., but there was one line in particular that didn't sit right. Unless I get lost. The word lost was underlined, twice. 6 p.m. passed, then the next day passed. The day after that, another note arrived in the mail. This one from Duluth, 150 miles north. It was Christopher, and in the note he admitted he wasn't actually sick. He just wanted to use the van. He said he was going somewhere but couldn't explain where, and apologized for what he planned to do. This time the message was painfully clear. Christopher didn't plan on coming back home. When his parents checked the house, they found something else was missing. His father's 20-gauge Mossberg shotgun. But no ammunition was taken, not a single shell, which left investigators wondering. If he planned to hurt himself, why bring a gun but no bullets? And if he didn't plan to use it, why take it at all? 2 days later, the van turned up abandoned. It was found parked on a logging road near Grand Rapids, almost 200 miles from home. Police didn't find any blood, no signs of an injury, and no weapons were found inside the van. But they didn't find Christopher either. He had stepped out of the van into the woods and seemingly disappeared. Then came the phone call. A week after he vanished, his parents picked up the phone and heard a roar of noise. Muffled music, voices, and laughter. It sounded like people. Lots of people. But when Christopher's parents pleaded for the person on the other end of the phone to speak, the line dropped. Christopher's best friend and neighbor started receiving the exact same type of calls. No voice, just the sound of music, laughter, and a lot of people. Christopher's mother remains convinced to this day that it was her son on the other end of the line. After 6 months of these calls, they stopped as abruptly as they had started. In 1993, the search for Christopher went national. Christopher's face appeared in the Runaway Train music video by Soul Asylum, a video that helped bring other missing kids home. But for Christopher's family, there were no updates and no verified sightings of him. The case took another bizarre turn in 2004 when the Eagan police received an anonymous letter. The writer told the police to stop looking for Christopher, claiming he would come back when he is ready. It sounded oddly personal and almost convincing. Almost. After a long investigation, authorities concluded the letter was likely a cruel hoax. After the Jacob Wetterling case was finally solved in Minnesota in 2016, local police reopened Christopher's file. They used age progression software to show what he might look like now. And the detective leading the case today still says the same thing every investigator before her eventually had to say. As of now, they don't know what happened to him, but they haven't stopped trying to find out. In the note Christopher left his parents on April 20th, 1990, he predicted he would come back home unless he got lost. He even underlined the word, twice. 35 years later, Christopher is still a missing person. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Christopher Kurz, you are urged to contact the City of Eagan Police Department at 651-675-5700. Nancy Stewart Franco Williams never had the kind of life that fit neatly into anyone's expectations. Born on October 9, 1961, she grew up in Powhatan Point, Ohio, a quiet river town where everyone knows your last name, even if they don't always know your story. Her daughter Jennifer didn't know hers at all for the first decade of her life. Jennifer was raised by her grandparents, and her relationship with Nancy would always have more questions than answers. Nancy's sister Shirley would later describe the situation in plain terms. Nancy was known for hitchhiking, barrooms, sex work, and run-ins with the law. It was the kind of instability that made worrying about Nancy a default feeling in the family. But even with all that being said, she still called home. She still showed up to visit. She still kept one foot, at least emotionally, in the Ohio Valley. Instead of borrowing couches, she rented rooms at places like the Rogers Hotel in Wheeling, West Virginia, or the Clarendon Hotel in St. Clairsville, Ohio. She stayed close, even when she stayed separate, but she almost never stayed solo. There was always a man with her. To her family, he was Robert Mayhew. To others, Bob Katz, Tom Katz, Tim or Timothy Wilson. It was a revolving door of identities that never quite made sense to anyone except Nancy, making it impossible to know which name, if any, was real. By early 1988, Nancy was 26 and living in Sandy Springs, Georgia. That's when she told her mother she wanted out. Not of town, but of him, whoever this man was. She was scared of him. She wanted to leave. And then the phone went quiet. In February 1988, Mayhew called Nancy's family collect. He said she'd left him and that she was already on a bus heading north toward home. It was meant to sound reassuring. Instead, it sounded like misdirection. Because Nancy never arrived. Nancy was reported missing, and the investigation stalled for almost 30 years, until 2017, when 2 images surfaced from old family belongings. One showed Nancy and a man beside her. That's the one detectives chose to release, and it's now the center of the case. The photo is painfully normal, and that's what makes it feel wrong in hindsight. Who is the man beside her? He looks older, self-possessed, comfortable in the frame, like someone who isn't being caught off guard being photographed. It's the only confirmed image of a man who, despite a long list of names, has never been identified, never been located. That Polaroid doesn't reveal violence. It doesn't give motive. It doesn't even solve anything. It just lingers as a key mystery in Nancy's still unsolved disappearance. It forces the question the case has hinged on for decades now. Who is this man, really? Police believe Nancy was killed, likely somewhere in the Ohio Valley region. The reasoning was never spelled out publicly, but it doesn't take much to read between the lines. That was the region she traveled through often. That was the region her family lived in. That was the region Mayhew said she was heading toward when he made the call. If it was a lie with a destination. Her case is still open, not because investigators expect a confession, but because someone, somewhere, might one day recognize the man in that photo and finally collapse all his aliases into one real identity. And maybe then, the story that never made sense could finally make a little more. Keiko Inoue's story starts in August of 1972. She just wanted a break, a few days away from the office, some fresh mountain air, quiet walks, and maybe a few photos to remember it by. Keiko's mother and brother originally planned to go with her but had to cancel. Keiko decided to go anyway. She caught the train from her hometown of Isesaki to Kirizumi Onsen in Gunma Prefecture, a remote mountainous area dotted with hot springs, hidden waterfalls, and trails through thick forest. She checked into a small inn and spent her first day exactly as she planned, soaking in the springs, exploring the trails, and taking photos of the scenery. On August 13, 1972, 24-year-old Keiko set out on foot into the mountains. She chose to walk rather than take the hotel shuttle, carrying her camera with her. Along the trail, she asked other hikers to take her picture. At the time, these small interactions seemed ordinary, friendly moments between strangers on a quiet mountain path. But in retrospect, they would become the last human encounters of her life. After Keiko didn't return home, and her family not hearing from her, they reported her missing. 3 days later, on August 16th, hikers discovered her body inside a remote work hut near a dam, about 4 kilometers from Kirizumi Onsen. The autopsy revealed she had been stabbed repeatedly with a single-edged blade and had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, a clear sign of a struggle. No weapon was ever found. No suspect ever came forward, but her camera was recovered at the scene, and the film inside offered a chilling window into her final hours. When the photos were developed, they traced her movements along the hiking trail. Every photo was a record of where she had been just hours before her death. And then there was the final image, the one that would become her last photograph. It was different from the others. Keiko wasn't smiling, she wasn't relaxed. At best, she looked uncomfortable. She stood stiffly in tall mountain weeds. Her expression was serious, almost unreadable. The location of the photo was quiet, isolated, and less than an hour from where she would be found murdered. In fact, police believe the photo was taken very shortly before her murder, the last documented moment of her life. 3 days after her body was found, a man called a local newspaper claiming he had met Keiko on the trail that day. He said she had shown him how to use her camera and asked him to take a photo. He gave his name as Ishida from Shimokitazawa, Tokyo, and promised to meet with police, but he never showed. Investigators later concluded the information he provided was false, and the lead ultimately went nowhere. No witness could be verified. No suspect was ever named. By 1987, Japanese law had closed the statute of limitations on her murder. The case officially went unpunishable. And since then, her killer has still never been caught. Her story has no closure. All that remains are her photographs, a record of her last day on Earth. And that one photo in particular that continues to unsettle anyone who sees it. Because in that last photograph, there are no answers, no clues, no hint of who was behind the camera. It's just Keiko, standing alone, unaware that the moments captured on her camera would be her last. William Richard Bradford didn't just kill, he curated. He composed moments in time, posed bodies, and arranged scenes like he was directing a shoot no one knew they were actually starring in. The most disturbing part of his case isn't just the murders he was convicted of in 1987, it's the gallery of lives he left unclaimed. At 36, Bradford was a Los Angeles truck driver with a camera always nearby. Photography wasn't a career for him. It was a doorway. A reason to approach women without raising alarms. A way to make a conversation feel like an opportunity. He'd meet them in bars, on sidewalks, near their homes. His pitch was simple, casual, almost charming. Let me take some portfolio shots of you. You could model. To many, it felt exciting. To two, it was fatal. Sherry Miller was 21, working nights behind a West LA bar when Bradford met her at the meat market. Tracy Campbell was only 15, his neighbor, a girl whose trust came easily because proximity made suspicion feel unnecessary. Both women were strangled, and both died after saying yes to what sounded like a harmless desert photo shoot. Their bodies were found near Point Mugu State Park, an area detectives located only because Bradford had photographed the landscape first. His own hobby became the breadcrumb trail that led to the truth. He was convicted, sentenced to death, and sent to San Quentin. But the case didn't end there. Not even close. In 2006, investigators reopened the evidence lockers and found something everyone had overlooked for more than 2 decades. 54 photographs, seized from his apartment in 1984. Women posed carefully, lit softly, framed like models in swimwear, dresses, lingerie. Shot with the same flattering eye he'd used on Sherry and Tracy. Suddenly, the photos weren't just evidence from his apartment. They were potential missing person reports waiting to happen. 48 of those images were released publicly, turning strangers into internet-wide cold case detectives. The country began trying to put names back onto faces Bradford had stolen into anonymity. The first major break brought relief. One woman was recognized as Nika LaRue, sister of actress Eva LaRue. She was alive. She remembered Bradford clearly, remembered posing for him, remembered being shown how to handle the camera. She was a survivor, and proof that not every photo of his ended in tragedy. Then came photo number 28. The woman was Donnelly Campbell Duhamel, 31. Last seen walking out of a bar with Bradford in 1978, 6 years before the 1984 evidence haul, long before the crimes he was sentenced for. Days later, her body was found decapitated in a Malibu canyon. Her identification confirmed something investigators had feared. Bradford's reach was wider, older, and darker than the crimes tied to his conviction. Bradford died in prison of natural causes in 2008 without a confession, no explanation, and no final act of accountability. All he left behind was a stack of photographs, with some identified and many still unknown. Each one a life paused mid-story. And that's what makes this case linger. It's not just about what we know he did. It's about what we'll never know unless the right person recognizes a face, remembers a moment, or finally asks the question Bradford made sure would outlive him. Who are they? And for some, did they ever make it home? Alexander Mengel didn't show up in history the way killers usually do. There weren't any warnings, no strange reports to look out for him, no whispers of what might happen. In February 1985, his name carried no weight, but by March, it carried the worst kind. It started like thousands of traffic stops before it. February 24th, 1985, in Westchester County, early in the morning. Officer Gary Stimulowski pulled over a 1973 Mercury Capri on the Sawmill River Parkway in Yonkers. It was a routine stop, unremarkable, normal, until it wasn't. Gunfire cut through the cold air and the officer never stood a chance. Mengel fled the scene, and hours later, Stimulowski was found slumped in his patrol car, shot and killed. Mengel disappeared into the winter, and the manhunt tore through New York, then past it, stretching over state borders and jurisdictions. Then another name went missing, Beverly Capone. She was 44, a mother, a sister, a normal life, right up until she crossed paths with Mengel. Within days, her Toyota was spotted in Toronto. Then on March 2nd, 1985, Canadian police finally caught up with him after a chase. He was behind the wheel of her stolen car. The evidence inside rewrote the case from tragic to horrifying. Beverly had been killed, and pieces of her were found in the vehicle. Later, the rest of her body was located beneath rocks near a secluded cabin in the Catskills, buried, hidden from sight. This wasn't impulsive violence. It was methodical, quiet, and intentional. But the case wasn't done surprising anyone, because a map was recovered next. An innocuous Pennsylvania tourism handout that Mengel had turned into something else entirely. There were X's and O's scribbled by hand over dense wooded stretches near Harrisburg. Searches of those areas yielded nothing concrete. But then came the photographs. 5 small images. 4 wallet-sized prints. 1 Polaroid. Young women. Teenage girls. But there were no labels, no dates, and no notes. Just faces. Those 5 faces were circulated for years through cold case units, task forces, and missing person files. Faces that investigators hoped would eventually click into place, but none ever did. Before detectives could get any more information from him, Mengel made sure they never would. On April 26, 1985, Mengel was being transported by New York State troopers for a court appearance, and he tried to escape custody. There was a struggle in the back seat, a trooper fired his gun, and just like that, the man who could have explained the evidence was gone. No confession, no motive, only the aftermath. So that's where the case stands. The map markings still unexplained, the photographs still unidentified, the full story still incomplete. If you've been with us a while, you might remember we covered Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance in its own episode during the summer of 2024. But today we're circling back to something more specific. Not the timeline, not the theories. Instead, it's one single piece of evidence that has lingered in the minds of her family for more than 2 decades. A photograph, a face, and a name that might not even be real. Amy's disappearance began with music drifting across warm Caribbean water. Ocean air, steel drums, laughter, and late nights on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship in 1998. A vacation that should have been ordinary became anything but. Amy was 23, athletic, magnetic, effortlessly social. On March 24, 1998, around 5:15 a.m., her father Ron saw her asleep in a chair on the family's cabin balcony. She wore shorts and a tank top, her cigarettes and lighter resting on the table beside her. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. Half an hour later, she was gone. Her shoes were still in the room. But the cigarettes, the lighter, those had disappeared with her. The family searched the ship, desperate for someone to act quickly. They begged for an announcement, for anything that might slow the flood of passengers leaving into Curaçao that morning. They were told no. The ship docked. The crowd spilled into port. And the moment for urgency dissolved into chaos. Over the years, the case grew tentacles. Possible sightings, nearly missed rescues, witnesses who came forward far too late, each story unsettling in its own way. But none of them, not one, ever delivered certainty. And then came 2005, an email notification from an unknown sender with an image attached. When Amy's family opened the file, they saw a young woman staring back at them. She looked familiar, but distant. The photo was labeled Jazz. She wasn't posed like a missing person. She was framed like a model. The lighting and composition was unsettling in a way staged photos often are. Her expression wasn't fearful, but it wasn't at ease either. It had reportedly appeared on an adult website, but stripped of context, name, and origin. Nothing to confirm any location and nothing to verify an identity. But the resemblance was impossible for them to ignore. She did have the same bone structure. But was it her? Legally and officially, no one has ever definitively said yes. But for her family, the questions never stopped. Because that photo wasn't just unsettling for what it showed. It was unsettling for what it didn't. Who took it? Where was she when it was shot? Was Jazz a name she chose or one she was given? And most painfully of all, was this the closest they ever came to seeing her alive again? Amy is still officially listed as missing, and that photograph remains one of the few physical artifacts tied to her case, an image that turned a disappearance into a possibility of survival, even if it couldn't prove it. And somewhere out there, someone still knows the story behind the lens. Someone knows the name behind the alias. Someone knows the truth behind Jazz. And that someone might be the key to bringing Amy home, not as a theory, not as a sighting, but as a person whose story gets to continue past a photograph. In 1167, smack dab in the Middle Ages, the world was small and slow. Most people back then never strayed far from the place they were born. Even the ocean wasn't something you visited, it was something you survived alongside of. And the people living in Orford, Suffolk, were no exception to this rule. It was a quiet coastal settlement, a predictable and largely uneventful place, home to generations of fishermen that worked its shores. One morning in particular, just before sunrise, they set out in their boats like they had done countless times before. The job was pretty simple, and largely the same even today. Drop the nets, wait, haul them back, and hope that the catch is worth the effort. Except on this morning, it was harder than usual to pull one of the nets back on board. The weight felt wrong. When the net finally broke the surface and slammed onto the deck, there was a dark, human-shaped silhouette inside the mesh. The only surviving account comes from a monk, Ralph of Coggeshall, who recorded the event years later with an almost uncomfortable level of detail. He wrote that the man was tall, completely naked, and covered by thick knotted hair. He was bald, but had a beard that was long, matted, and unkempt. The fishermen didn't try to chat with him. They didn't ask questions. They didn't even pretend to. They tied him up, hauled him to shore, and marched him straight to Orford Castle, dropping him in front of the local authority and leaving him for them to deal with. The stranger didn't speak. Not when the guards pushed him, not when they tried to scare words out of him. Nothing worked. They learned more about him through his diet than anything he ever said. He didn't want anything cooked. He wouldn't even look at it. Raw fish was the only thing he'd eat, and he didn't eat it normally. He prepared it. Slowly and methodically, he would press each fish between his palms to squeeze out the water and oils before eating it. It was a practical method, something you'd learn in a place where every calorie and every drop of liquid matters. There was no waste, no eating frenzy, just efficient eating. They took him to the church after a few weeks, hoping for some kind of reaction, but he didn't flinch. Eventually, they decided he wasn't violent, just different. So they let him swim, but not without precautions. 3 massive nets were layered across the harbor, built like an underwater checkpoint, but it didn't matter. He dove in, hit the first net, and tore through it. Then the second, then the third. And without hesitation, he popped up on the other side before the guards even finished shouting. Then he turned back toward the shore, looked at the men who had captured him, and waved. Not frantically, not angrily, just a simple, almost casual gesture. Not mockery, not gratitude, just acknowledgement. A punctuation mark on an encounter nobody understood in the moment and still doesn't understand now. After that, he swam north, out into open water, and was gone. Disappeared the same way he arrived. Unannounced, unexplained, untraceable. Historians today lean toward a less supernatural explanation. A foreign sailor who survived a wreck, lived in brutal isolation long enough to lose his language, and got turned into a legend. And maybe the most frustrating part is that nearly 900 years later, we still don't know who he was. In 1609, a French explorer named Samuel de Champlain stood in a wooden boat on a massive freshwater lake, a lake bordering the states we now know as New York and Vermont. A lake that would eventually carry his own name, Lake Champlain. Samuel was charting shorelines, taking notes, and trying to make sense of a continent that still felt brand new. But in that moment, something under the surface of the water pushed upwards, something long, thick, and alive. Champlain later wrote about it, stating that he saw a creature roughly 20 feet long, thick-bodied, and shaped like a serpent, or at least more snake than fish. The entry in his journal was brief. It seemed like it was a quick observation, and written matter-of-factly. He didn't call it a monster. He didn't give it mythology. He simply recorded what he saw. And honestly, that's a big reason anyone still talks about it. People love to argue about what he really saw that day, but it's agreed that what it most likely was a giant lake gar, which is a very real fish that can hit impressive lengths and definitely lives in those waters. But in 1609, nobody was debating what species it could have been. They were just repeating the important part. Champlain saw something massive in the lake. For the next 200 years, the stories lived locally, passed between dock workers, ferry captains, lakeside families, anyone who crossed it for work or relied on it for survival. The creature hadn't even been named, but it didn't need one. It was just part of the lake's personality. But in 1819, the tone changed. In 1819, a ship captain named Nathaniel Crum publicly reported seeing a creature that behaved unlike any fish or mammal he recognized. He said it moved fast and carried a long neck above the water before slipping back under. The newspapers ran with it. Sightings of the creature snowballed. By the late 1800s, the story was loud enough to catch the attention of P.T. Barnum, who immediately smelled opportunity. In 1873, P.T. Barnum, America's greatest showman, announced a $50,000 bounty for the capture of the creature. He wanted it alive, he hoped that it was massive, and he planned to place it center stage at the World's Fair. But it was classic Barnum. Big announcement with zero follow-through. Then came 1977, when the story got weird again in a totally different way. A woman named Sandra Mancy was on a family trip near St. Albans Bay, Vermont, with her Kodak Instamatic in hand. She saw something rise up from the water, and she snapped one photo. A single captured frame before the creature dipped back underwater like nothing happened. But the photo is exactly the kind of evidence that causes fistfights at dinner tables. It was grainy, blurry, and taken from pretty far away. The photograph became known simply as the Mancy photo, and it's exactly the type of thing investigators love and skeptics hate. To believers, it was proof that the story had some truth to it. To skeptics, it was proof that the story was a misidentification. What no one could argue, though, was the reaction that followed. Both states, New York and Vermont, passed official protections for the creature known by then as Champ. Hunting it was banned, harassing it was off limits. If it actually existed, it was now legally untouchable. If it didn't exist, 2 state governments had just enshrined a rumor into law. Lake Champlain is over 120 miles long, carved by glaciers. It drops beyond 400 feet deep in places, filled with freezing water and blind corners. And down there, absence of evidence doesn't sound like a conclusion. It's hidden everything from shipwrecks to entire ecosystems. So the idea that it might also hide a creature older than the Republic, well, it never sounded completely ridiculous, at least to the people who live beside it. So maybe Champlain simply saw a fish, or maybe he actually saw a creature that no one has been able to verify since. Either way, the lake kept its secret to itself since 1609. In late September of 1808, winds battered the North Sea along with sheets of rain, roaring gusts, and violent waves. When the sea finally calmed, the fishermen of the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland, went back to their routines, repairing nets, checking fishing lines, and walking rocky beaches for debris washed in by the storm. One of those men was John Peace, a local fisherman. And on the morning of September 25, 1808, he was walking the shoreline at Rothiesholm Head on the island of Stronsay when he noticed something unusual. It wasn't a whale. It wasn't a seal. But lying on the rocks was a carcass, enormous, and undeniably dead. But it wasn't any animal the locals recognized. Word spread quickly, and people came from miles around to see it. They measured it. They touched it. They debated what they were looking at. In testimony given later under oath, witnesses estimated its length at 55 feet, longer than most boats fishing those waters. But the anatomy of the beast was what unsettled people most. The carcass appeared to have an extended neck, 15 feet long by some accounts, ending in a small head. Along its back ran a mane of bristles, and the strangest of all were the appendages along its sides. 6 limb-like structures that onlookers insisted looked like paws, not fins. Descriptions varied, but nearly everyone agreed that this was no ordinary fish. News of the discovery reached Edinburgh, where the city's Natural History Society took an interest. Rather than dismiss the accounts as superstition or mistake, they assigned the creature a provisional scientific name, Halcedrus pontopidani, loosely Pontoppidan's water snake, treating it as a potential new species. For a brief moment, a sea monster seemed to be scientifically recognized. Then a surgeon from London, Sir Everard Home, examined what remained: the skull and several vertebrae that had been preserved by local collectors. Home didn't see a beast. He didn't see mythical limbs or bristles. He saw cartilage, not bone. He saw shapes and structures consistent with a basking shark, a large, slow-moving fish that could reach impressive sizes. The supposed tiny head on a long neck was just the shark's decomposed cranium after its lower jaw and gill arches had fallen away. The bristles were just frayed muscle and connective tissue, and those paws were the decayed remnants of fins, reshaped by exposure to the elements. To Home and scientists in London, it was clear that this wasn't an unknown monster, and at least officially, the case was closed. But the people of Stronsay didn't agree to sign off on that conclusion. These were men and women who knew the sea like the back of their hands. They saw sharks hauled in every season. They could tell fish by the shape of a fin or the curve of a spine alone. They insisted what they saw had been flesh, not mushy cartilage. They swore the creature had limbs, not fins. They remembered its weight, its texture, its presence on the shore that day, in a way that no other washed-up fish has ever been remembered since. And so the story split. To scientists, it was decomposition. To the locals, it was something they could never explain. More than 2 centuries later, the Stronsay beast survives in both versions, one rooted in anatomy and science, the other in testimony, conviction, and the stubborn human certainty that sometimes the world is stranger than science is ready to admit. In 1893, in the thick backcountry of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, a story crawled out of the woods and into the local press. Rhinelander at the time was a logging town, a place built on sweat, sawdust, and isolation. Most of the men worked 6-day stretches deep in the forest, sleeping in camps. From time to time, there would be someone that said they'd seen something strange in the forest, but people usually shrugged it off. The woods were big, the men were tired, and shadows can play tricks on people. But when Eugene Shepard made a claim, people entertained the story. Not because he was reliable, but because he was Eugene. Shepard was a timber cruiser, a scout hired to estimate the value of forests before the logging companies moved in. He was also, by reputation, a troublemaker known for mischief. A surveyor first, a storyteller second, and not necessarily committed to the order of those jobs. So when he told reporters he'd discovered a creature he called the Ho-Dog, the first reaction was amusement. Curiosity came second, and belief came much later. His description was wild and borderline theatrical. A horned, claw-footed thing with a spiked back and a fat, amphibian-shaped face frozen into what he described as a permanent green grin. He added other strange specifics, like that it ate only white bulldogs and that it only hunted them on Sundays. They were ridiculous details, but the papers printed it anyway. Not because they trusted the science, but because they trusted him. Not for truth, but for entertainment. Then, in 1896, Shepard gave them more than description. He gave them actual hope when he announced he'd captured one. His explanation was a performance, but it was a convincing one. He said bullets bounced off the Ho-Dog, so he had to improvise. He crafted a long pole with the tip dipped with a chloroform-soaked sponge. He started jabbing it toward the creature from a safe distance inside a cave, until the thing supposedly collapsed into unconsciousness. According to Shepard, he then dragged the limp, anesthetized beast out into daylight. He placed the live Ho-Dog on display at the Oneida County Fair, inside a canvas tent lit low enough that imagination was needed to fill in the gaps. Visitors claimed the creature growled, lunged at them, and thrashed around the tent, all while Shepard stood nearby, delivering warnings to keep back, performing the role of both zookeeper and security. The story spread beyond Wisconsin, and eventually it spread far enough that the Smithsonian planned to send actual scientists to evaluate the creature in person. Shepard confessed before they packed their bags. He revealed the hodog was never an undiscovered species. It was just carved wood, stitched hides, and wired mechanics, animated in the dark by his sons. The twist of the story is that the town really didn't care. They adopted it. Shepard hadn't created a monster. He had created a mascot, something awkward, strange, and oddly lovable. Exactly the traits the locals recognized in themselves. Over the following decades, the hodog became a source of civic pride. And today, Rhinelander, Wisconsin still uses the creature on police vehicles, school emblems, roadside statues, and local business signs. The hodog was born from a prank, but it survived because people decided it belonged to them. And in that way, it became real. Not in the biology textbooks, but in the culture of a town that looked at the woods, heard the story, and said, yeah, that sounds like us. November 1896 in St. Augustine, Florida, was full of slow days and salt air. But one evening, on Anastasia Island, two young boys on bicycles stumbled across something that would make their town famous for decades. On the sand, they found a massive carcass. It wasn't a shark, it wasn't a fish, and it had no obvious head or tail. Just a sprawling pinkish rubbery mass, roughly 18 feet long, weighing an estimated 5 tons. Locals called it a monster, though no one could agree on what kind. Most of the townspeople just stared, keeping their distance. But Dr. DeWitt Webb, a local physician and founder of the St. Augustine Historical Society, approached it and started hacking at the flesh. The first blow of his axe bounced off. The carcass was dense, elastic, resistant. Nothing like the soft, oily blubber of a dead whale. Webb suspected he had found something extraordinary, a massive invertebrate, maybe a giant octopus. But Webb thought that no octopus that size could exist, so he pressed on. He took tissue samples, photographed the creature, and sent them to the Smithsonian and Yale University. One expert, Professor A.E. Verrill, examined the evidence and declared it a new species, Octopus giganteus. But the pushback came shortly after. Other scientists insisted it was just whale remains. Verrill retracted his bold claim. The supposed octopus became a generic bag of blubber, and the academic world moved on. But Webb didn't give up. He spent weeks hauling the carcass higher up the beach with teams of horses trying to save it from the tides. Eventually, nature won. The St. Augustine monster disappeared back into the Atlantic. Still, Webb had preserved samples in formalin jars. Those jars sat in the Smithsonian for a century, labeled only with question marks, waiting for modern science to examine them. In 1995 and again in 2004, researchers ran electron microscopy and biochemical tests on the tissue. The verdict? Not an octopus, but also not a typical whale. The material was almost pure collagen, the thick, rubbery outer skin of a sperm whale, sloughed off as the body decomposed, drifted, and hardened in the sun and sea. Webb had been wrong about the species, but he wasn't wrong about the scale of the phenomenon. The St. Augustine monster wasn't a sea creature with tentacles and teeth. Instead, it was an unrecognizable remnant of something massive, dead, and strange. We live in a world where moments are constantly being recorded. Security cameras, doorbells, dash cams, cell phones pulled out at just the right or wrong time. You'd think that with all of this footage, mysteries would be harder to hide, but in some cases, the opposite happens. In this episode, we're looking at pieces of footage linked to cold cases, clips that should have explained everything, but somehow made the story even more unsettling. A few seconds of video, a passing figure, a final glimpse of someone who would never be seen again. Some of these recordings captured ordinary moments. Others caught something that still doesn't make sense. And in every case, the footage became the last solid thread investigators could hold on to. Because sometimes it's not what's caught on camera that haunts you. It's what happens just after the recording ends. The West Mesa sits just outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, a wide stretch of high desert on the edge of the city. For most of its history, it wasn't a place people went. It was a place people dumped things. Old tires, broken appliances, anything that didn't belong anywhere else eventually found its way out there, left to rot in the dirt. So on the morning of February 2nd, 2009, when a local woman took her dog out for a walk across the mesa, nothing about it felt unusual until she noticed something sticking up from the ground. At first, it looked like more trash, just another piece of debris half buried in the sand. But when she got closer, she realized it wasn't trash at all. It was a human femur, and that single bone cracked open something the desert had been hiding for years. Police quickly flooded the West Mesa, turning the area into a massive crime scene. At first, investigators hoped that it was an isolated grave, a single victim, a one-off discovery. That hope didn't last long. As forensic teams began digging, using heavy equipment, ground surveys, and aerial imaging, the truth came into focus. Shallow graves were scattered across the mesa. Inside them were the remains of 11 women and one unborn child. The media would eventually give the unknown killer a name: the West Mesa Bone Collector. As the victims were identified, a pattern started to emerge. These women, mothers, daughters, sisters, had vanished years earlier, most between 2003 and 2005. Many came from vulnerable communities. Some had been involved in sex work. When they disappeared, their cases didn't get much attention. They were written off as runaways, as people who'd chosen dangerous lives and simply never came back. The graves erased that narrative completely. This wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. It was one person, acting deliberately, over and over again, while an entire city failed to notice who was missing. As investigators searched for a suspect, one name rose to the surface almost immediately: Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya lived less than 3 miles from the burial site. His record showed a long history of violence against women. Tire tracks near the graves were said to be consistent with vehicles he had access to, suggesting he knew the mesa well enough to move through it without drawing attention. But there was one problem no investigation could get around. Lorenzo Montoya was already dead. In 2006, the same year the West Mesa disappearances suddenly stopped, Montoya lured a 19-year-old woman named Sharika Hill to his trailer and strangled her. This time, he didn't get away with it. Sharika's boyfriend tracked her down, confronted Montoya, and shot him dead. When police searched Montoya's trailer afterward, they found something deeply disturbing: a home video hidden among his belongings. Only a small portion of that footage has ever been released. It shows almost nothing visually, just a dark, grainy wall. But the audio is unmistakable. Off camera, you can hear duct tape being pulled from a roll. Investigators believe the video may be recording the sound of Montoya, preparing a body for disposal. If so, the woman in the footage was never identified. The location couldn't be confirmed. And on its own, the tape wasn't enough to prove anything. But the implication was chilling. If the video was real, it suggested Montoya wasn't just killing, he was documenting it, holding on to it for his own record-keeping. Without any other evidence, and with Montoya dead, investigators hit a wall. No DNA tied him directly to the remains. No witnesses placed him at the graves. And yet the circumstantial evidence refuses to fade. He lived nearby. His violence matched the pattern, and when he died, the killing stopped. Officially, the West Mesa murders remain unsolved. For the families of 11 women and one unborn child, there was no trial, no confession, and no certainty. Only the unsettling possibility that justice may have already been delivered years before anyone even knew a serial killer was out there. Anyone with information is asked to contact the 118th Street Task Force at 505-768-2450 or Crime Stoppers at 505-843-STOP. It was just before 7 in the morning on January 25th, 2019, and the town of Tomball, Texas was just starting to wake up. Elizabeth Barraza was already awake and in her driveway, setting up folding tables for a garage sale. She was hoping to make a little extra money for a 5th anniversary trip she was planning with her husband. Nothing fancy. Just a normal morning, doing a normal thing, in a quiet neighborhood. And that's what makes what happened next so unsettling. A neighbor's Nest camera caught the whole thing. And at first, there's nothing about the footage that feels alarming. A dark-colored Nissan Frontier crew cab pickup truck pulls up along the curb. The driver's door opens and a person steps out. They just walk, calmly, up the driveway toward Elizabeth, who's still standing there among the tables. Whatever was said, it didn't seem to raise any red flags. And then, without warning, 4 gunshots ring out. Elizabeth drops to the concrete. The person stands over her for a moment and fires one last shot at point-blank range. Then they turn, run back to the truck, get in, and drive away. Elizabeth Barraza died from her injuries the next day. Detectives were left stunned. Elizabeth didn't live a risky life. She had no criminal ties, no known enemies, nothing that pointed to this kind of violence. Her world was her family, charity work, and her community. But the video tells a different story. Whoever did this knew she'd be outside. They knew about the garage sale. They showed up at the exact moment she was alone. This wasn't a random act. It felt planned. It felt personal. And yet, despite how clear the footage is, the person remains a mystery. Their face is hidden. Their identity unknown. The black Nissan Frontier has never been found, and neither has the person behind the wheel. All that's left is the video, watched again and again by investigators, reporters, and strangers online. A murder captured in plain sight, and still no answers. If you have any information that could help solve Elizabeth Barraza's unsolved murder, you are urged to call Crime Stoppers at 713-222-TIPS. December 8, 2000 in Dublin, Ireland was a typical, relentlessly wet, cold, miserable night. On top of that, a citywide taxi strike had emptied Christmas parties straight onto the streets, forcing thousands of people to walk home in the rain. Trevor Deely was one of them. He was 22 years old, worked in IT at Bank of Ireland Asset Management, and by all accounts was just an easy guy to be around. Friendly, laid back, the kind of person people naturally liked. That night, he'd been out celebrating with coworkers at Buck Whaley's nightclub, enjoying himself like everyone else. But as the night wound down, reality set in fast. There were no taxis, the rain wasn't easing up, and home was still a long walk away. So Trevor made a practical decision. He decided to walk to his office building, about 10 minutes from the club, to grab an umbrella before heading home. At 3:35 a.m., CCTV captured the rear gate of Trevor's office building. At first, the footage looks unremarkable, just a wet, empty stretch of street in the middle of the night. But when Trevor arrives and unlocks the gate, he's not alone. A man dressed entirely in black approaches him. The two exchange a few words, and nothing about it seems tense. No raised voices, no sudden movements. It looks casual. Maybe a quick greeting. Maybe the man asked for a cigarette or a light. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to worry Trevor. After the brief interaction, Trevor went inside. He made himself a cup of tea. He checked his email. He even talked to a coworker who was working the night shift. Nothing about his behavior suggested he felt threatened or in danger at all. At 4:02 a.m., Trevor was captured on CCTV, leaving through the same office gate he entered, this time with an umbrella in hand. 12 minutes later, at 4:14, another camera caught him walking along Haddington Road, heading in the direction of his apartment. But then the camera picked up someone else. Seconds after Trevor walks past, the man in black is seen walking right behind, at the same pace and in the same direction. Trevor then turns a corner and disappears from view, and the man follows him into the darkness. And that's where the story stops. Trevor Deely never made it home. He never used his phone again. His bank accounts were never touched. And despite massive searches, including repeated dredging of the nearby Grand Canal, no trace of Trevor or his umbrella has ever been found. As police dug deeper, they uncovered more footage of the man in black. CCTV from the office building showed him standing outside for more than 30 minutes before Trevor even arrived. To investigators, it didn't look like someone killing time. It looked like someone waiting. Was this just a random encounter that went terribly wrong? Or had the man in black been waiting for Trevor long before he ever reached that office gate? The footage is all that's left, and all it shows is a young man walking into the night, with someone just a few steps behind him. Anyone with information is asked to contact Pierce Street Garda Station on 01-666-9000 or the Garda Confidential line at 1-800-666-111. March 7th, 2018 was a Wednesday in Worthing, England. The sky was clear, and it was one of those mornings that felt like nothing could possibly go wrong. That morning, Georgina Garsala, a 30-year-old mother of two, left her home to run a quick errand. Nothing unusual, just a normal stop before getting on with the rest of her day. She was wearing a gray coat with a thick fur-lined hood. At around 9:50 a.m., Georgina walked into the Clifton Food and Wine store, a small neighborhood shop she knew well. The security camera inside captured her clearly. She looked calm, relaxed, not rushed at all. She chatted briefly with the staff and bought a phone minutes top-up card, which suggested she planned on using her phone later. Then she paid, turned, and walked back out the door. The camera followed her as she turned left, heading west along Clifton Road. And that's the last confirmed sighting of her. Worthing isn't some isolated village or stretch of countryside. It's a modern town, covered in cameras. Shops, busy streets, intersections, buses, trains. And yet Georgina never appeared again on any of them. Somewhere along Clifton Road, she slipped into a blind spot. She didn't show up at the next intersection. It was as if she vanished halfway down a road she'd walked countless times before. Months later, the case took a turn that unsettled investigators. Police discovered a piece of footage recorded at 4 p.m. that same day, more than 6 hours after Georgina had last been seen. The video came from Chapel Road, right in the middle of Worthing's busy town center. The footage was grainy and distant, but it showed two women walking side by side through the crowd. One of them looked a lot like Georgina. Same height, same build. And most unsettling of all, she appeared to be wearing the same gray coat with the fur-lined hood. If that woman was Georgina, it raised even more questions. Where had she been for those missing 6 hours? Why hadn't she used her phone? Why hadn't she contacted her family? And who was the woman walking beside her? The clip was examined over and over, by police, by specialists, and by members of the public desperate for answers. But nothing could be confirmed. If that really was Georgina, then she didn't disappear that morning at all. She was walking through her own town in broad daylight, surrounded by people. To this day, the identities of the two women in the footage remain unknown, and Georgina Garsala has never been found. For her family, it leaves behind one impossible question. How does someone walk out of a shop, onto a busy street, and simply vanish off the face of the earth? If you have any information that can help find Georgina Garsala, you can reach out to Crime Stoppers at crimestoppers.org. State parks were designed to be preserved, protected, and clearly marked. Trails mapped, campgrounds numbered, and boundaries drawn with the expectation that people who entered would also be able to easily find their way back out. But over the years, that expectation hasn't always been met. Across the United States, people have entered state parks and have never left, disappearing without explanation. Some disappearances left behind vehicles parked exactly where they should have been. Others with a single piece of hiking gear found far from where it should have logically ended up. This episode looks at 4 of those cases. First, we'll look at the case of Michael Allen Fisery and his disappearance after setting out on a hike in Yosemite, alone. Then we investigate the disappearance of Barbara Bollock and her story of vanishing in New Hampshire while hiking a familiar trail. Next, we look into the story of Aaron Hedges, who went missing in the crazy mountains of Montana during an elk hunting trip. And last, we'll dive into the case of Drake Kramer, who went missing from Grand Canyon State Park in Arizona, leaving behind questions that still haven't been answered. Different locations, different circumstances, but all with the same outcome. These 4 people entered protected wilderness areas and were never seen again. In this episode, we're examining disappearances in state parks and what happens when the trail ends without any explanation. The north side of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir isn't what most people imagine when they think of Yosemite National Park. Long before it became a massive reservoir, the land had been used as a managed meadow by the Miwok and Paiute people. By the early 1900s, it was flooded with 117 billion gallons of water, held back by concrete and granite. And in June of 2005, somewhere out there, a man disappeared. His name was Michael Allen Fisery. He was 51 years old, lived in Southern California, and was no stranger to the outdoors. Michael was active and extremely fit. He biked, surfed regularly, and spent as much time hiking as he could. He didn't carry a phone, he liked being off-grid, and he had a near photographic memory. He also knew Hetch Hetchy well. On Wednesday, June 15, 2005, Michael set off alone on a planned hike. The route he chose to take would take him past Rancheria Falls, up toward Tiltil Mountain, and eventually to Lake Vernon. It was ambitious, but not unheard of, even though his family later mentioned that Michael sometimes believed he could cover more ground in a day than was realistic. When June 19th came and went and Michael still hadn't returned home, his family contacted the National Park Service. What followed was one of the largest and most expensive search and rescue efforts Yosemite had ever seen. Over the next several weeks, crews from 5 counties joined the search, along with U.S. Marines and specialized aircraft. The cost climbed to somewhere between $450,000 and $500,000. Michael's car was found where it was supposed to be. But out on the trails, things were quiet. Tracker dogs couldn't find a scent. Cadaver dogs came up empty. But then came the one discovery that changed everything. Searchers found Michael's backpack near Tiltil Mountain, just off the trail, close to the snow line. Inside was a topographical map and a camera bag, but the camera was missing. Michael was known to always carry a 1-gallon milk jug full of water, marked clearly with his name, but that was missing as well. To the people who knew him, that detail was the scariest, because Michael did not abandon his gear. Ever. His friends were adamant about that. Everyone held on to hope, remembering a time years earlier when Michael had broken his ankle in Yellowstone and still managed to crawl back to safety on his own. At first, they thought that maybe this was another version of that story. Michael injured, stranded, but still alive, somewhere out there. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, nothing else surfaced. No tracks, no clothing, no remains, no camera. The terrain around Tiltil Mountain is unforgiving. Steep granite cliffs, sudden drop-offs, and dense wilderness where a single wrong step can mean literally disappearing forever. Some believe Michael may have slipped and fallen somewhere no one could reach. Others have wondered whether something more sinister happened, though there's no evidence to prove it. Michael Allen Fisery is still listed as a missing person and cold case by the National Park Service. And somewhere beyond the trail near Tiltil Mountain, whatever happened after he stepped into that wilderness remains a secret the mountains have kept for nearly 20 years. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Michael Allen Fisery, please contact the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch. You can submit an anonymous tip by calling or texting 888-653-0009. Or you can email them directly at nps_isb@nps.gov. You can also visit nps.gov/submit-a-tip. Every detail, no matter how small or how much time has passed, could be the key to bringing answers to his family. On July 18, 2007, Barbara Bullock headed out for a hike in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. The trails weren't new to her, and neither was hiking. Barbara, 51 years young, was experienced in the outdoors and in good shape. She wasn't alone that day either. She was with Jim Ramaker, a friend visiting from California. Together, they set off toward Bear Creek Overlook, a scenic spot about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. It was a straightforward hike. Nothing technical, nothing risky. They reached the overlook without any issues, took in the view of the Bitterroot Valley, shared a snack, and then turned around to head back down. And that's when everything went wrong. As they descended, Barbara walked ahead of Jim, about 20 to 30 feet in front of him. The trail was clear. Visibility was good. At one point, Jim stopped, just briefly, to turn back and take one last look at the view behind them. He later estimated it was less than a minute. 45 seconds. Maybe a full minute at most. When he turned back toward the trail, Barbara was gone. At first, it didn't make sense to Jim. She hadn't turned off the trail. There was nowhere obvious to go. Jim called her name, thinking maybe she'd stepped ahead or was just hidden behind a bush or a tree. But there was no response. Just the quiet of the woods. She had vanished. Jim called for help, and the search and rescue teams arrived quickly. Ravalli County Search and Rescue launched a massive effort, joined by hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, and helicopters equipped with infrared cameras. The terrain around Bear Creek Overlook is steep in places, with thick timber and sharp drop-offs, so the primary theory was a fall. Teams searched the slopes below the trail again and again, but nothing turned up. Barbara had been carrying a black backpack with her, and inside it was a .357 Magnum revolver. It was a heavy piece of metal and not something that disappears easily. So metal detectors were brought in, hoping that could help find a trace of Barbara, but still nothing. Searchers looked for any trace of fabric, gear, disturbed ground, but there was nothing. No backpack, no firearm, no clothing, no blood, no sign of a struggle. In the years since her disappearance, investigators have explored every possibility. A sudden medical emergency, a predatory animal, a freak accident. No matter the scenario, each theory ran into the same problem. There was no evidence to support it. Jim Ramaker was questioned extensively, and he cooperated fully, even taking a polygraph test. He was never considered a suspect, and his account never changed. He maintained the same story until his death in 2014. The trail to Bear Creek Overlook remains popular, but for those who know the case, it's a place that carries a heavy weight and still unanswered questions. Like, how does a seasoned hiker disappear in under a minute, on a clear trail, just a few steps ahead of someone she was there with? At the time of her disappearance, Barbara was 5 feet tall, about 115 pounds, with dark red shoulder-length hair and brown eyes. She was wearing a pastel-colored shirt, tan shorts, and sturdy hiking boots. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Barbara Bolick, please contact the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office at 406-363-3033. No detail is too small. Your information could provide the breakthrough needed to bring Barbara home. In September of 2014, the crazy mountains of Montana lived up to their name. The range is notoriously unforgiving. Towering rock faces, sudden weather changes, and terrain that can turn dangerous fast. It was there that 38-year-old Aaron Hedges, an experienced hunter from Bozeman, Montana, vanished in a way that still doesn't fully make sense. Aaron headed into the mountains with 2 friends for what was supposed to be a week-long elk hunting trip. The plan was straightforward. Hike in, set up camp near Sunlight Lake, and spend the week hunting at high elevation. But early on, something felt off. Aaron was carrying a heavy pack and struggling to keep pace. At some point along the trail, he told his friends to go on ahead, that he'd catch up once he slowed things down a bit. It wasn't dramatic. No argument, no concern. But that was the last time anyone saw him alive. When Aaron never showed up at camp, alarm bells started going off. Search teams were brought in, but almost immediately, they ran into a problem. Nothing lined up. There were no signs of Aaron along the route he was supposed to take. No tracks, no gear, no indication of where he might have gone. Nearly a year later, the case took a strange turn. In 2015, searchers found a small cache of Aaron's belongings, but not where anyone expected them. His bow, hunting boots, and hydration bladder were discovered miles away from Sunlight Lake, and worse, in the opposite direction of his intended route. What really unsettled investigators were the boots. They weren't torn up or scattered. They were placed neatly together, and the area where they were found was brutal. Sharp rock and uneven ground, the kind of terrain that would shred bare feet in minutes. Walking through it without boots would have been almost impossible. Over the next several years, more pieces slowly surfaced. In 2016, a rancher made a discovery on private land, Aaron's remains along with his hunting pack. The location was miles beyond where his boots had been found, on the other side of the mountain range, roughly 15 miles from where he was last seen. To reach that spot, Aaron would have had to cross a ridge that rises above 10,000 feet, and he likely did it during a snowstorm. The question was how. Because Aaron was experienced, he had quality gear, and he was carrying a GPS. And yet somehow he became so disoriented that he traveled farther and farther away from help. Authorities believe hypothermia played a major role. In severe cases, it can cause paradoxical undressing, a condition where the body feels intensely hot, leading someone to remove clothing or boots. There's also something called terminal burrowing, where a person instinctively seeks out tight, enclosed spaces as their body shuts down. Those explanations offer some answers, but not all of them. Why Aaron changed direction, why he crossed such extreme terrain, and why his gear appeared in stages, scattered across miles of wilderness. While his family eventually got the closure of finding his remains, the full story of Aaron Hedges' final days in the crazy mountains is still unknown. His case has become one of the most often cited examples of how even skilled outdoorsmen can disappear, and how the wilderness doesn't need anything supernatural to be deadly, just the cold and time. If you have any information regarding the 2014 disappearance of Aaron Hedges in the Crazy Mountains, please contact the Sweetgrass County Sheriff's Office at 406-932-5143. Even the smallest observation from fellow hunters or hikers in that area can make a difference. In February of 2015, the south rim of the Grand Canyon became the backdrop for a disappearance that still feels painfully personal. Drake Kramer was 21 years old. He was a student at Central Washington University, known by friends and family as thoughtful, kind, and deeply connected to nature. He had a way of feeling things intensely, and in the days leading up to his disappearance, something seemed to be shifting. Drake began sending a series of messages to family and friends. They weren't threatening, they weren't panicked, but they were unsettling. He talked about being on a spiritual journey and about needing to return to Mother Earth, about reaching a sense of peace and enlightenment. Then, on February 1st, Drake checked into the Bright Angel Lodge, a scenic hotel that sits at the south rim of Grand Canyon National Park in Arizona. The next morning, February 2nd, Drake was seen leaving the lodge, and that was the last confirmed sighting. His car was still parked outside. Most of his belongings were left behind in his room. He hadn't checked out, and he never contacted his family again. His family would call the National Park Service after not hearing from him, and the search began. Rangers, technical rescue teams, and helicopters flooded the area. They focused on the Bright Angel and South Kaibab trails, the most likely routes. Crews rappelled into sheer drop-offs. They searched the forested areas along the rim. They covered hundreds of acres in freezing winter conditions. And they found nothing. No backpack, no jacket, no footprints, no sign that Drake had fallen, climbed, or wandered off trail. The only clues were the messages he'd sent before disappearing. Drake's father shared that his son had spoken to him about reaching a kind of spiritual clarity, that his soul was at peace. For some, that raised fears that Drake may have intended to harm himself. For his family, it left the door open to other possibilities, that maybe he walked away on purpose. There were a few cell phone pings in the days after he disappeared, but in a place as massive as the Grand Canyon, they were too broad to narrow down anything meaningful. Today, Drake Kramer is still considered a missing person. His car and belongings were eventually returned to his family, but the canyon never gave up anything else. Drake's disappearance shows just how deceptive places like this can be. The same place millions of visitors pass through every year can be the same place someone can disappear, without leaving behind a single trace. If you have any information concerning the disappearance of Drake Kramer, please reach out to the NPS Investigative Services Branch at 888-653-0009 or the Coconino County Sheriff's Office at 928-774-4523. Any information, regardless of how insignificant it may seem, could be vital to the investigation. When you look back at human history, there's one obsession that shows up over and over again. Even before money, before power, and long before fame, people have been obsessed with death. As soon as we started ceremonially burying our dead, we started wondering how to avoid joining the same fate. And for thousands of years, people believed the answer could be made, not found, discovered, or created. Today it sounds like fantasy, but for much of history, this was taken seriously, very seriously. Emperors funded research on how to create it themselves, scholars chased after it, and alchemists devoted their entire lives to it. The belief was simple. Somewhere out there in the world was a substance that could slow aging, cure disease, and extend life. But the history of the elixir of life isn't just a story about wanting to live forever. It's also a story about dying sooner. One of the most famous examples is Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. He unified the country, ordered the construction of the Great Wall, and ruled with absolute authority. But according to historical records, he was terrified of death. There are writings that speak of expeditions that he sent into the eastern seas searching for immortal beings. He was said to have ordered his top alchemists to prepare elixirs that could keep him alive forever. And those elixirs often contained mercury. At the time, mercury seemed like a magical substance. It was heavy, shimmering, and unlike anything else on Earth. Alchemists believed it held powerful, life-preserving properties. Today we know the truth, that repeated exposure to mercury causes severe neurological damage and organ failure. Qin Shi Huang died at just 49 years old. And while the exact cause of his death is unknown, many historians believe that mercury, the very substance meant to save him, may have helped kill him. Centuries later, the obsession resurfaced in Europe with the legend of the Philosopher's Stone. Medieval alchemical recipes for these elixirs of life survived the time, and they're still readily available to this day. And with our knowledge now, they're unsettling to say the least. They include crushed gold, arsenic, lead, sulfur, and of course, mercury. We like to think we're different today, that we're smarter people now, more advanced. We don't swallow poisons anymore, hoping it will make us immortal. But we do have other things. We invest billions of dollars into cryonics, experimental blood treatments, genetic manipulation, and radical life-extending research. Sure, the methods may have changed, but the fear of death definitely hasn't. And one thing is for sure, history suggests that when people spend their entire lives trying to outrun death, they somehow just end up meeting it sooner. If the elixir of life was driven by pure vanity, this next idea was something else entirely. This was about devotion, sacrifice, and a deeply unnerving question. How far would someone go to heal a person who wouldn't even be born for another 100 years? To answer that, we have to talk about something known as the mellified man. The name almost sounds harmless, benign. It comes from mel, the Latin word for honey. But this wasn't a dessert. Instead, it was about turning a human body into medicine. The earliest known written account appears in the 16th century, recorded by Chinese physician and naturalist Li Shizhen in his medical encyclopedia, Benkao Gangmu. Li described the mellified man as a foreign practice, reportedly originating in the Middle East or Arabia, something he didn't witness himself but was still able to document. The description he preserved is arguably one of the most disturbing in medical history. According to the account, the process began with a volunteer, usually an elderly man nearing the end of his life. Someone who agreed to sacrifice himself for medicinal purposes. For months, sometimes even longer, the man would consume nothing but honey. Drinking it, eating it, some versions even claimed he would bathe in it. The idea was to saturate the body, completely. Eventually, the man would grow weak and die, almost certainly from malnutrition. But that was only the beginning. After death, the body was placed in a stone coffin and filled entirely with honey. The container was then sealed, marked, and stored away, not for a few years, but for an entire century. After 100 years, the coffin would be opened. If the process had worked, the body would have broken down and merged with the honey into a preserved, hardened substance called the mellified man. According to the belief, it was used as medicine, most commonly for treating broken bones and severe trauma. A small piece of the resin would be shaved off and ingested, thinking that it would help with healing. The thing is that there is no historical evidence this substance was ever actually produced or sold. Most modern historians view the mellified man as folklore, possibly exaggerated through centuries of trade stories along the Silk Road. But here's the part that keeps the story from being dismissed outright. Medical cannibalism was very real. Around the same period throughout Europe, people routinely consumed powdered human skull, blood, and fat as medicine. Egyptian mummies were ground up and sold across the continent as cures for everything from headaches to internal bleeding. So while the mellified man may never have existed as described, it came from a world where the line between medicine and death was already thin. Whether it ever happened or not, the idea alone tells us how far people were willing to go in the name of healing, even if the cost was everything. The story of Mithridatium begins with Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, a man who may have been the most paranoid ruler in the ancient world, a man actually remembered as the Poison King. To really understand Mithridatium, you have to understand the world Mithridates ruled in, around the 1st century BC. In royal courts, assassination wasn't rare, it was expected. Mithridates realized early on that he couldn't trust his guards, his cooks, or his family. So instead, he decided to trust biology. He withdrew from society and disappeared into the wilderness for years, treating himself as a living experiment. He began ingesting tiny, non-lethal doses of the deadliest toxins known to man: arsenic, hemlock, aconite, even snake venom. The idea was simple, but terrifying. If I drink a little bit of quote-unquote death every day, eventually death won't be able to hurt me. He mixed these poisons with antidotes like rue, ginger, and cinnamon, grinding them into a thick, pungent paste. This was Mithridatium. It wasn't a cure for any specific disease. It was a daily vaccine against murder. And according to the legends, it worked. Mithridates became a biological tank. He could sit at a table, drink wine laced with arsenic that would kill a horse, and smile while his enemies watched in horror. It gave him a psychological edge that no army could match. He was the man who could not be killed. But there is a cruel irony to the story of the Poison King. After decades of war, the Roman Empire finally crushed him. The great General Pompey had Mithridates cornered in a citadel. The king knew the game was over. He wasn't going to let the Romans parade him through the streets in chains. He chose to go out on his own terms. He grabbed the poison he always kept close, a massive dose meant for a quick, painless death. He drank it. He closed his eyes. He waited for the end. And nothing happened. His stomach churned, but his heart kept beating. He had spent his entire life building a tolerance, perfecting his immunity, and constructing an invisible shield around his internal organs. Now, in the one moment he actually wanted to die, his body refused to let him. The elixir he had created had worked too well. In a panic, with Roman soldiers breaking down the gates, Mithridates had to turn to his bodyguard. He begged the man to draw his sword and stab him to death because the poison wasn't working. The Romans were so impressed by his resistance to poisons that they stole his recipe. Mithridates believed he could make himself untouchable. By slowly poisoning his own body, he thought he could stay one step ahead of death itself. And in a strange way, it almost worked. Mithridatium was carried back to Rome, studied, adjusted, and expanded on. Roman physicians didn't see it as a finished cure. They saw it as a foundation for something much better. They would call their miracle substance theriac, and it was unleashed at the perfect time. When theriac entered the world, medicine wasn't interested in small fixes anymore. Doctors weren't trying to treat one symptom at a time. They wanted a single answer. One substance that could protect the body from everything. Theriac was that answer, or at least that was the promise. For nearly 2,000 years, theriac became the most famous medicine on Earth. From ancient Rome to medieval Venice to early modern London, this was the prize behind any apothecary's counter. The most expensive remedy. The most closely guarded recipe. Sometimes it was locked away. Sometimes it could only be prepared under official supervision. In some cities, it was mixed in public, so no one could accuse the seller of cheating them. By the Middle Ages, it contained dozens of ingredients, sometimes more than 60, sourced from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Saffron, myrrh, cinnamon, rare resins and roots hauled in from distant ports. But one ingredient made theriac legendary: viper flesh. The logic followed the thinking of the time. Snakes were deadly. Snakes carried venom. So somewhere inside the snake, they believed, had to be the secret to surviving poison. Apothecaries roasted vipers, ground them into powder, and stirred them into the mixture. Making theriac wasn't quick. It was ritual. Ingredients were fermented into a thick black paste, sometimes for years, before being declared ready. In places like Venice, this wasn't just medicine. It was theater. And people believed in it. If you had the plague, theriac. If you were bitten by a snake, theriac. If you couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't escape the pain, theriac. But the secret behind its success wasn't ancient wisdom or rare ingredients. Instead, it was opium. And theriac was loaded with it. So when someone swallowed a spoonful, they didn't actually get better. The disease stayed. The infection remained. But the pain wasn't as severe. The fear wasn't as intense. The suffering wasn't as bad. And in a world with no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no real understanding of disease, relief like that felt like a miracle. So no, Theriac didn't save lives. But for the time, it made the worst ones bearable. That's how it survived for nearly 2,000 years. Not because it worked, but because it felt like it did. It wasn't until modern chemistry and evidence-based medicine arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries that Theriac finally disappeared from pharmacy shelves, replaced by better answers. What it leaves behind is an uncomfortable truth that sometimes humanity isn't looking for a cure. Sometimes we're just looking for something, anything, to take the edge off reality. When you picture the daily life of a king in the 1600s, you probably imagine banquets, hunting parties, and endless political drama. What you probably don't picture is a royal laboratory. But King Charles II of England, the so-called Merry Monarch, had one. Hidden inside Whitehall Palace, just under his living quarters, Charles kept a private chemistry lab. And while the public knew him as a pleasure-loving king who brought theater, music, and parties back to England after the Civil War, there was another side of him few ever saw. Charles was obsessed with science. He was deeply interested in chemistry, medicine, and alchemy, and he spent long hours experimenting, distilling liquids, heating compounds, chasing the same dream many rulers before him had chased: the idea that death could be delayed. And his greatest fascination centered on a strange medicinal concoction known as the King's Drops. Charles didn't invent the formula himself. Historical records suggest he acquired it from a physician and chemist named Jonathan Goddard, a respected figure in England's early scientific community. The exact amount he paid for the recipe is debated, but contemporary sources agree it was extraordinarily expensive, so valuable that the recipe became closely guarded royal property. Charles reportedly believed in it, completely. He prepared the drops himself, drank them regularly, and claimed they restored his energy and protected his health. So what was in this miracle medicine? It wasn't gold, not any kind of rare spices. Actually, it's not anything you'd expect, because the primary ingredient was human skull, specifically powdered skull taken from a person who had died violently. This wasn't fringe magic. It was mainstream medicine in 17th century Europe. At the time, doctors believed the body contained a vital essence, often called spiritus or life force. If someone died slowly from illness or old age, that essence was thought to fade away. But if a healthy person died suddenly, by execution, accident, or violence, that life force was believed to remain trapped inside the body. And the skull, they believed, was where it concentrated. Medical texts of the era recommended skulls from executed criminals, especially those who had been hanged or drowned. The bone would be dried, ground into powder, and distilled into alcohol to create a tincture meant to treat everything from seizures to stroke to internal bleeding. This practice even had a name: medical cannibalism, and it wasn't rare. While the common people scraped corpse moss from graveyards, Europe's elite consumed powdered mummy, human fat, blood, and bone, all prescribed by licensed physicians. The only real difference was access. The poor used the bodies that died of illnesses, disease, and worse. And the most powerful man in England was drinking medicine made from the bodies of the condemned, at least until February of 1685, when King Charles II collapsed. He suffered what modern historians believe was a massive stroke. His physicians rushed to his bedside and promptly unleashed every treatment they knew. They bled him repeatedly. They blistered his skin. They applied hot instruments to his head. And finally, in desperation, they poured enormous doses of the King's Drops down his throat. The alcohol may have dulled the pain, but the skull powder did nothing. After days of suffering, Charles II died. He's widely remembered as the king who restored joy to England after years of Puritan rule. But behind the music and the parties was a man who believed salvation might come from a bottle, distilled from the bones of the dead. He was a king searching for life in the remains of others. And like so many before him, he learned too late that some cures don't cure anything at all.